Okay. Can you hear me now? Any indication? Okay, that's great. Thank you, Rami, and thank you, Larry, for cooperating. Okay, so as I mentioned, this is the second session for our CISSP Bootcamp, and thank you everyone for indicating that you hear me. Lots of activity in our chat room. For this session, we will cover as much as possible from Chapter 1 in our CISSP book. And hopefully we will get to Chapter 2 as well, and maybe we can even complete that one as well during this session. If you have any questions, if you have any indication of a question, I would love to get it through the meeting chat. That's the option that you have on Teams, and we will try to answer those as we go in the live session as we hold it. If any of you have any question on previous session, I would love to get that from you as well before we start this session. So just as a quick reminder, last session we covered a lot of the CISSP background and what is expected from us as future CISSPs in the eyes of ISC. We touched base on the CIA versus DAD, the confidentiality, integrity, availability of the information versus the disclosure, alteration, and destruction of information on the other hand. We also touched base on the I and AAA, the identification, the fact that everybody can claim any identity, and then authentication, which we will try to get as much as possible closer to a strong authentication without affecting the productivity, and then authorization, the need to know and least privilege principles, and auditing, make sure that we can hold people accountable to what they actually do. We also touched base on the strategic goals through tactical and operational metrics of the organization. Basically, any business works this way, and we mentioned that as well. Last session was concluded with change management and the process of change, approving change, getting the change in front of a review board, and then actually executing the change and making sure it actually works. So from testing to production and production to testing backing, and if something fails, and then all the way to lessons learned and educating the organization. There are a few roles in the change management process, and I highly recommend on going back there to that presentation and understanding the process itself, because ISC might ask you of what step comes before each one of them. So make sure you're on top of that as you go through the change management parts in your book. For this session, we will start from the data classification. So data classification and classifying your data is important because you want to make sure that information is protected the way it should be protected, the way the organization is expecting it to be protected. So in ISC in general, we have two different types of organizations, or ISC put together the two different types of organization. One is always the government/military, so any type of governmental entity or country entity, if you may, versus the commercial business, versus the private sector. So one is very dictating in their security program. One is the government, of course, and the other one is more driven by numbers, by money. Commercial businesses are out there to make money, and we need to remember that as we approach the questions of the ISC. So if we look at the government and military data classification, there are 5 levels of data classification for government. And I divided them, I chose to divide them into 3 and 2. So the way IAC explains those to us is that confidential, secret, and top secret levels of classification are always there for the government, and the government understands, or everybody in the government understand what to do with confidential information. For example, IT gets confidential information from a specific department. If it's labeled confidential, then they have the right quote-unquote container for that type of information. If that information is being declassified now and then reclassified as a secret information, then it should be protected by a whole different container, maybe with a whole different controls. So again, going back to the CISSP, and it's all a game of controls of how we implement those controls. The confidential controls might be different from secret controls, and those doesn't have to be the same controls and another layer. So if you look at the confidential container, quote unquote, you can probably have a certain type of access control, a certain type of physical security, but then on the secret level, you might have a whole different ballgame. The access control might be the multi-factor authentication, and the physical control will also include a lot of alternative sites and screening your personnel and so on and so forth. So don't look for the controls that are accumulating from one level to another. Those can be different controls. The way I chose to remember this slide for the CISSP exam is to look at it at 3 and 2. The confidential, secret, and top secret levels of data classification are there for us to actually classify the information. It's very understandable what's behind, what are the requirements behind those levels. Now, the first two, the unclassified and SBU, sensitive but unclassified, are both on quote unquote in the waiting room, if you may. This is the way to remember this. Those two are not classified yet. They will be classified maybe later on in the future, and maybe we will take the unclassified type of data and classify it as confidential. Maybe this process will take 5 minutes, maybe this process will take 5 years. But as long as the information is not classified, it can be here under unclassified and also under SBU, sensitive but unclassified. And people ask me, what is SBU? What is the difference between SBU and unclassified? So the difference between the two is for unclassified information, I can have any type of information that the information didn't classify yet. But the sensitive but unclassified is the information that the organization didn't classify yet, but we know it came from a very sensitive source. So high rank military personnel, their information will probably rest here in the sensitive but unclassified level, and it will not probably be under unclassified. So it's all depends on the source of information. Now, once those are classified, each one of them, they will become either confidential, secret, or top secret. So I hope that one helps clear the air around this slide, because in your book, in the CISSP book, it's kind of spread all over the place. So kind of hard to understand it all the way. So I hope this slide makes it easier for you to understand. Now, when we look at commercial data classification, it's a whole different ballgame. The commercial data classification helps us protect the organizational interests. And when we are there to protect the organizational interests, we're really talking about money and monetary consequences that can take place. So if we look back at the government and military data classification, the objective behind classifying data is protecting national security, okay, government interests. these are different interests than the commercial side of businesses or the private sector. When we're there to protect the commercial side of businesses, we're there to protect their money and to avoid fines and to avoid lawsuits and so on and so forth. So for this one, we also have 3 different levels of classification, of data classification. And when I choose the number 3 is just to make it easier for us to remember. Okay, so for this one, going back to the military and data, we have top secret, secret, and confidential. When we look at the commercial data classification, we have high, medium, and low. It's easy to remember it this way. Now, look at it carefully. When we look at low level of classification of data, we talk about public data, which in government is a level that we don't have for classifying data. And it makes sense because the data that the military has or the government has is never really public. You cannot treat it as public. You can treat it as unclassified, but as we mentioned before, it kind of rests in that categorization. Later, after the public data is classified, we look at sensitive data. Sensitive data is basically budget plans, financial accounting data, and any data that is kind of for internal use of the organization. This is not the type of data that I probably or any organization will probably have any type of contractual agreement on. We will not have NDAs behind sensitive data. We will have NDAs behind confidential data, and we will have contractual obligation for the private data. And today with the GDPR and CCPA and all these privacy regulations, we see a lot of them covering this type of data, the private data. So for the medium side, I would say the controls are really to protect your data from being leaked or being shared with the people outside the organization that shouldn't be exposed to this type of data because it can affect the business. It can affect the process of a business, but it will probably not get to any lawsuit. The first 2, which are considered as high type of classified information, are divided into 2, the private data and confidential data. So the way to remember this is to look at private data as the data that an individual owns. So for example, my social security number is considered private data. And when I share it with my the health provider or care provider that I work with, that social security number is my private data, and I trust that organization to protect my data. But when the organization builds a database of social security numbers, now that organization is the owner of the database. It's not the owner of my record, it's still mine, but is the owner of the entire database of the social security numbers. And that database is now considered confidential data because it includes private information of my own and others as well. So let me look quickly if we have any questions in our chat room, in our meeting chat. I don't see any questions, but if you do have a question, please raise your hand through the meeting chat, and I'll try to answer those as well as we. So look at this slide and look at the previous slide as well. And what ISC can ask you through the CISSP is what type of classifications, data classifications, or levels of the classifications do we have for government/military, and what type of data classification levels criteria do we have for commercial? And when you try to remember all this 5 and all this 4, it's kind of setting from time to time to answer the questions. So what I would like you to take from this part as a tip is to remember the words private and public. On domain 3, we will touch encryption, and we will talk about private and public keys in under PKI, public key infrastructure. So the words private and public kind of repeats and throughout the CISSP. And here, if you look at private and public data classification levels, those two levels do not exist in the military. So ISC will ask you what type of data classification exists in both. And if you see private and public, you know those are not the answers, because in the government, you cannot have any private data. Everything you do belongs to the government. And also the government cannot have any public data, or the military cannot have public data, because it risks the national security. So the way to remember it is to remember that confidential and sensitive data exist in the commercial data classification, and here top secret, secret, and confidential, and also sensitive here. So as you can see, sensitive and confidential exist in both. So I expect those type of questions from ISC on your exam as you go. I hope you guys cannot see the way I jump between the screens because I do jump to the chat room from time to time. So if you don't mind, just give me an indication that you cannot see me jumping between the screen. You only see the slides of my PowerPoint. Yes, thank you, Rami. It's nice to see you guys actually listening and participating in this, even when you're muted on this online bootcamp. So for data classification, just to summarize that, we have 7 steps in classification of that IC identified for us as CISSPs. The first one is to identify the custodian, and I try to make it easy for you guys to remember. However, I couldn't really find a way around that. So unfortunately, there are those 7 steps. We just need to remember them and memorize them until we get that. The way ISC is going to ask us questions about this is they're going to ask what comes before this step in data classification. So the first one is to identify your custodians. The custodians are those that we trust to actually maintain the data or maintain the level of protection on the data. The next one is when we specify the evaluation criteria of how this information will be classified and labeled. So the custodian is first, the people that will build and be responsible for the containers, and then what are the criteria for each container. That's kind of easy to understand. And then classify and label each resource. So for this step, we need to think of it as we build the containers, we have the custodian, everything is ready. Now we open the gate and we decide on what comes in and what doesn't come in to this type of container. The next one, the fourth one, is documentation, and documentation is important throughout the CISSP. Whenever you do something, you have to document it, because if you don't document it, it doesn't exist, and we cannot pass an audit if we don't document the, in this case, any exception to the classification policy. So, for example, let's say we have top secret information, but we decided to classify it as secret for some reason, or vice versa. This exception must be documented, because someone will come later on, something will happen, something will hit the fan, and then we will need to provide answers. If we have documentation throughout the CISSP creates accountability, and this is important to remember. And I think we mentioned the accountability in our last session. Then we select the security controls. The security controls, even though we already specified the evaluation criteria here for that container, we didn't specify the controls needed for the for this type of information. So here we provide the levels of controls. We ask for the certain controls to be in place for each type, for each category of classified information. And then we specify the procedures for declassification. Declassification is the process of removing data or removing information from that container. So we put it in, we know the type of controls, and now we want to take it out because we either want to unclassify it or we want to reclassify it. It can happen both ways. And then the awareness program is really the communication. So when we talked about the first session, we talked about the role of the CISSP is about communication and collaboration. Here, as you can see, we don't do things on our own. We work with others. So that's part, the first 6 are the collaboration of us with everybody in the organization and kind of directing them on the right path to classifying their information. The last session here, the last part here, the last step is communication. So we need everybody to be aware of the classification system that we built, and we want them to follow it, and we want them to work by it. So again, the 7 steps in classification, just to summarize it, is first identify your custodian, then decide on the criteria, classify the information, exceptions, if you have any, and documentation, put in the controls, the right controls, make sure you have the declassification process in place, and then make sure everybody remembers. Again, there's no easy way around this, but you will need to remember all 7 steps. Next one is really important for the CISSP and any ISC type of certification you will decide to take later on. So for this one is the 6 primary roles in security that ISC put together for us. And those 6 will go with us as we continue with our studies through the CISSP and again any other ISC certification. The first one is always your senior management. The senior management are your business owners. Business owners are the decision makers. They're the ones that are responsible for everything that happens in security. Now, if it sounds a bit odd to you, it's okay. It's okay if it sounds a bit odd to you that senior management are now responsible for security and not you as the CISO and not you as the CISSP. But as we go through the roles and responsibilities of security, we understand more and more that how the senior management needs to be responsible. We cannot decide on data that we don't own. We, the CISOs, we, the CISSPs, we cannot decide on data that we don't own. Maybe HR owns some of the data. Maybe finance owns part of the data. Maybe the CEO owns their own data, his own or her own data, and we cannot decide for them. Things that we can do is recommend on specific controls and containers, as we saw the data classifications, and that comes in as the role of the security professional. These are us, the CISSPs fall under the security professional. The data owner is one very unique one, and we always want to target that one because the data owner is your risk owner, and everything we do is around risk management and controls. It's all a game of cost and benefit risk management, controls implementation, controls removal, and so on and so forth. The next one is the custodian, data custodian. So the data custodian is the trustee of the data owner. Ultimately, the trustee of the data owner that the data owner trusts the custodian to handle their information and to keep the CI&A controls in place. Then we have the users. Every user in the organization, including senior management, security professional, all of us are users at the end of the day. And then comes in the auditor. So the auditor will be the one to make sure that everything happens by the book as we intended. And those people, the auditor, is there to make sure accountability is being enforced. Now, take a look at this one carefully because it's really important to remember this square here. The data owner and the data custodian can never be the same person. This is really important for IC. Those two cannot exist under the same person. If I am the data owner, I cannot be the data custodian. It's a conflict of interest, and I hope this one makes sense to you all. And if it doesn't, then text me on the chat room. And again, the data custodian cannot be the data owner. So I cannot protect my own data. If I do that, this is this is a one-man show, quote unquote, and I'm in a conflict of interest because I want to share this information. Hence, I bypass all security controls, and hence I cannot be held accountable on my own data because I kind of bypassed all controls here. So if it doesn't make sense to you, let me know in the chat, and I'll try to emphasize this part more. But any other part, any other role in security can coexist with the others other than these two. So a data owner can be a senior management member, and security professionals, let's say the CISO is part of senior management. He is the data owner of his own security program. He's also a user, and he's also auditing everything IT is doing. IT is the data custodian, the users, and they audit their third parties. They audit their vendors, for example. They can be part of, CIO can be part of senior management. So all other roles can coexist except these two. If you're the data owner, you cannot be data custodian, and vice versa. This is really important to remember for your exam because there will be questions about this. Next topic is due care and due diligence. These are terms that we need to remember and we need to understand before the exam. The due care and due diligence kind of coexist when organizations approach to being held accountable, if you may. So in organizations, you will see management going through the due diligence process when, for example, they're about to acquire a new company or a competitor or a small company. So they're going through a due diligence process. So in this due diligence, they need to make sure that they did everything above and beyond to understand the risks behind their next action, the action of acquiring that company. But it's a one-time action that they need to take in a specific month, in a specific quarter, for example, but then it ends. The due care is the duty to care for everyone in the organization on security throughout the year. So the due care is a quote unquote never-ending task for everyone. The due diligence has a start and an end. The due care is also executed by everyone in the organization, while the due diligence is executed mostly by management. And if you want to better remember this, look at it from the initials for DC, do the correct thing, and then DD for due diligence, do detect. So detect it when things are not being done correctly. The due care and due diligence are very popular in CISSP exams, so you can expect 1 or 2 questions around that. And from the 100 questions that you have, this is a lot. This can be significant. So again, due diligence is one-timer and mostly under the management responsibility. Due care is the ongoing. The duty to care is for everyone in the organization's users and senior management as well. Now let's look at the security directive controls, and directive controls are those administrative controls, the controls that are written and documented. Those controls will be policies, standards, baseline guidelines, and procedures. So if you look at the structure of those controls, the policies, the broad security statement kind of reminds us the strategy, tactical, and operational type of approach in businesses. So everything starts from the head of policy. So this one is a broad security statement. Let's say we want to keep CINA of the information. This is a good policy. Or the policy is the password policy that we have is that you have strong passwords throughout the organization and combined with another factor of identification, whether it's a smart, an RFID card, a smart card, or a token, or a biometric type of authentication system, whatever you decide. This one will be a broad security statement. Then we have 3 directive controls, the standards, baselines, and guidelines, and we will get back to those in a second. But the closing one is your procedures. So the procedures goes back to your policy and look at the policy and say, okay, you want to protect the CINA of the information. This is how you do it on a day-to-day basis. You make sure you have your backups ready, you make sure you have your access controls ready, you make sure you have your checksum working on a day-to-day basis to make sure CINA is being enforced. Now, in the middle, we have the standards, baselines, and guidelines. Those three directive controls are specifics for how we enforce the security statement on policy on one side and then procedures on the other side. So in order for us to work in the with the environment that we want, in order to achieve this type of policy and in order to enable this step-by-step instructions or day-to-day actions, we need to have certain hardware/software security definitions in place. For example, we only use computers from one vendor and not any other vendor. If we're super sensitive on that hardware, so we can have the local hard disk encryption or local drive encryption. We also use software. We also use a certain version of Windows, for example, Microsoft Windows, for example. But we don't use anything beyond below that, and that will bring us to the baseline. The baseline is the start point. So what will be the minimum requirement to support this policy and to support this day-to-day actions? The minimum requirement is tied with this hardware and software security definitions. And then comes the guidelines. So the guidelines will be it's recommended, kind of the recommendation of something that we want to have in place. So it's highly recommended to have a password that is more than 8 characters, since 8 characters is considered very weak, but still something that we can use in our organization. We highly recommend to have more than 8 characters, but it's not mandatory requirement. So these 3 standards, baselines, and guidelines will enable, on one hand, the policy enforcement, and then the day-to-day actions on the procedural side. Again, checking the chat room to see if we have any questions. And guys, girls, please feel free to ask questions as we go. I'll try to answer those as I get them. The next one is the combination between threat and vulnerability, and we're getting to the point that we will talk about risk and risk management per se very soon. In this one, we will talk about threat modeling, threats, vulnerabilities, threat vectors, and attack surface. Those are terms that we need to understand for our CISSP exam. ISC expects us to not only understand them, but understand the connection between all of them. So let's look at the threat modeling. Threat modeling is basically when we get questions about that, we need to think like hackers. We need to think like our opponent, and not the ISC type of opponent, but the hacker in security type of opponent. ISC treat the threat modeling from 2 perspectives. Both are Microsoft approach for threat modeling. One is the DREAD, and the DREAD is the previous model, and the current one is the STRIDE. So each one of them will have their own threats categorization, if you may, and those DREAD and STRIDE models, you don't really need to fully understand everything that is behind them as it appears in your book, but you just need to remember what to use it for. So for example, if I run penetration tests on my organization, on my systems, I can ask the vendor to work by the STRIDE approach of Microsoft, for example, if it's a Microsoft-based system. And if it's not, we can still use the STRIDE. Then the threat, it's important to remember that the threat modeling is basically asking someone to play your opponent, to play your hacker. And that's the main objective behind threat modeling. Now, when you do threat identification by threat modeling, it's basically asking what are the threat sources, what are the motivations, and what is the actions taken by the threat sources. So how will a hacker actually work against my systems? And it's important to understand the behind the scenes here of your hacker. It's not enough just to ask someone to come in and do your PT, penetration test. You need to understand how they do it. And then vulnerability identification, vulnerabilities, the assumption that we have is that vulnerabilities always exist. However, threats with no capability of exploiting a vulnerability, if we don't have this connection between the two, a threat cannot exploit a vulnerability, then we might not have a risk or not a real risk. And when we talk about the connection between the vulnerability and threat together, even with both threats and vulnerability together, there's not necessarily a risk yet. The threat needs to be able to take an advantage of the vulnerability. So for example, a threat can be your hacker. Vulnerability can be Windows 2003 out of scope, out of support in your system. But if the hacker is coming from the outside, from the internet, and that system is not even connected to your network, it just exists there as a standalone, not connected to anything, there is the potential risk that someone will probably not pay attention and connect it to the network. So when that happens, then we have the threat vector. But as long as this system is not connected to the network, the threat that is a hacker is not relevant for this system, for this vulnerability. So pay attention to those questions as you take them, because they might want to confuse you there by just mentioning a vulnerability with no real threat in the question. When we talk about the attack surface, we really talk about the surface that we can expect threats and attacks from. So I chose the picture of this house, the really glassy house. As you can see, the surface that we have for attacks are everywhere. It is everywhere, because from every window we can expect someone to be able to come in. So unless those are armed windows, someone can throw a stone in one of them and just come in. So this is the attack surface. The more windows we have, the wider the attack surface, the more opportunities we have for the attackers to exploit. For this one is concluding that part of the threats and vulnerabilities. I'm just looking at the chat room again to see if we have any questions. You guys are very polite. You don't overwhelm me with questions, but again, I need those questions, so feel free. Also, if you want to speak, let me know, and we will get you unmuted, and we'll let you speak throughout the bootcamp as well. Okay. Now, next one, and again, we're approaching the part of risk management as ISC wants us to understand, and in general, this is how we do risk management. So businesses, when they acquire or go through mergers and acquisitions, they go through changes, and there can be questions about potential acquisitions. For example, they can ask you a question about this major company enterprise, worldwide enterprise that doesn't operate in China. They want to acquire a small company from China. What are the risks that the acquisition of that company introduce to us in the security landscape? I can think of maybe 5, 6, or even 10 right off the bat. The first one is regulations. The first one is governance, and we will talk about governance as well later on, hopefully during this session. The governance of how they do businesses in China might be different from how they do businesses anywhere in the world. So we need to be aware of the change in the rules of the game of security these days. Privacy probably defined different in China than in the US or than in Europe. And even the US and Europe are not the same in privacy. Big Brother is not something that is taken light in Europe, while in the US is very legit to look at everything that your employee is doing because your employee is on your clock, quote unquote. So every change that the business is going through is important for us as security personnel to be aware of and to consider all risks that are related to that change. And we talked about change management in the last session and relates to that as well. Third-party governance is our governance when we look at everyone that is working with us or we work with them. So anyone that is not the organization can be a partner, can be a vendor, can be anyone that is not our organization. The governance that we hold on third parties can come from, as we mentioned before, can come from laws and regulations and standards, but also contractual obligations, for example, licensing and licensing requirements. Those obligations we can see when we post or someone else posts RFI, the request for information. So when someone is reaching out to the public, to vendors, and asking for information, what they're basically asking is, let us know what kind of solution you can provide us for this need that we have. This alone creates the connection that can lead to contractual obligation. It's really important to understand that once the organization responds to RFI, the request for information comes from another organization, someone can hold us accountable against this information that we provided. They can say, okay, you provided it in writing, you provided it in response to RFI. This is beginning of a contract between us, and you need to stand behind it. The RFI is the first stage of procurement, and the second stage will be your RFP. RFP is the request for a proposal, and it again relates to third parties and how we work with them. The RFP now is to say, okay, the information you provided is interesting. Now, this is the scope of work that we need from you. What can you provide us? So we respond to the RFP and we say, this is the scope of work that we see ourselves providing you. Now, the third part is the RFQ. The third party comes back and say, okay, we like your proposal, we like the information that you provided. Now, what will be the quote on that? What will be the price tag on this? And we say, okay, for this one, you will pay $1 million. So this is the price tag. This is the Q. Now, the RFP and RFQ are most likely to be in one part, in one request. And we can expect them to be together. However, in your CISSP, our IC square might separate them into three. So it's the first one again is RFI. I'm asking for information from potential vendors. Then I pick those vendors and ask specific vendors for proposal on my scope. I say what I'm asking for, and then I ask them those that are screened from those that propose the proposal, ask for a quote, and then I pick them from everybody else. I pick my vendor, and then when we do choose vendors, what we want to remember is to have the security by design approach, and the security by design and privacy by design as well approach when we reach out to potential vendors, because again, every purchase, every acquisition brings new risks. And we need to remember that for our questions, and we need to remember that for the CISSP, and how we can put the requirements for security in the RFI, in the RFP that we post out there. Whether we are the vendor or whether we are the organization that would like to work with vendors on this. both sides should consider security by design and privacy by design. The vendor governance is when we already work with vendors, we already chose them, now we bring them in to work with us. They join our environment, our secured environment, and we want to make sure that those vendors comply with our requirements for security. So when we do vendor selection, it's really important to put together criteria for vendors. So a vendor of organization can only work and operate in a certain geographical area in the world and not in anywhere else. For example, U.S. government will always buy from a U.S. local provider and not providers offshore, or they will look at it differently if it's a provider from an offshore from outside the U.S. Also, vendors should comply with our policies and governance plan. So if we if our organization is doing medical records and we have PHI, protected health information, then any vendor comes into this protected environment must sign a BAA, a business associate agreement, before they can work with us. So they say in the business associate agreement, they say we comply with all the security requirements as a vendor of your organization. So this is compliance of the vendors with us. A few terms that we need to remember for the CISSP. The first one is BPA, a contract between two partners, two businesses, making a contract with one another, agreeing on partnership between them, going through a certain business adventure together. So BPA is business partnership agreement. The next one is Memorandum of Understanding or Memorandum of Agreement, MOU or MOA. This is you can look at it as a piece of paper that two executives met in a restaurant and decided that this will be the new adventure for both organizations or both of us, and they just wrote it on a piece of paper. Didn't really agree on it. It's not really a contractual agreement per se, but it's still something that we can hold each other accountable on if we don't have anything else. It's not an agreement as we know it as a legal agreement, but it's kind of a piece of paper that we can be obligated to, or we say that we want to be obligated to, and in a later on process we will actually write the legal agreement that is behind it. The Interconnection Security Agreement, the ISA, is when two organizations want to connect their information systems. So it's more of a technical agreement for two organizations. And here we specify all technicalities. The NIST 800-47 can help you get through the interconnected information technology systems, get through the controls and as a guideline for how to do interconnection security in two different organizations. It can help you. It's not mandatory for the CISSP to remember the NIST 847, and I see that I have misspelled NIST here, so yes, this should be T and not A. Sorry about that, guys. The SLA is the service level agreement of our organization as a provider of any type of service to another organization or an individual, but everybody that is outside the organization. The SLA is a contract that we sign or obligation that we have with our customers. Now, in the SLA, you can expect things like, we will respond to your call or to your support call within X amount of time, within 2 minutes. We will send a technician to pay you a visit in your office within a day, within 24 hours. This is the SLA. This is the contractual agreement that we have with our customers. However, the SLA is being supported by an internal agreement, which we call operating level agreement, OLA. So the OLA is the agreement between different business units inside the same organization to support the SLA that we have with our clients. So the OLA is the agreement between, for example, IT and security to provide services as an MSSP, for example, if our company is MSSP. So IT is the custodian of all systems in the organization. However, security is obligated to provide services using those systems to the clients. Now they need to have the OLA between them to make sure IT works with security. They play well together, quote unquote, inside the organization. So the OLA supports the SLA, and they need to be aligned. So it's important for you as a CISSP to understand both sides and make sure those agreements are aligned with each other. The enterprise license agreement is when you do licensing, software licensing in big organizations, global organizations, and you need to enforce the license agreement on your organization. You have software everywhere, you have Windows licenses everywhere, you have Office licenses everywhere. You are bound to using those softwares according to the enterprise license agreement, as much as we see with, for example, Microsoft is a good example of the ELA, enterprise license agreement. Next, the software license agreement is when you use a software. Now you can use, you don't need to use only Microsoft software to get the software license agreement. You can use any type of software, even open source, they have license agreements. The license agreement we become obligated to once we quote unquote break the seal, once we check the box of agreed to all license agreement, the EULA, the end user license agreement. We agree to that. We open the seal. We click next, and then this is an agreement that we can be held accountable against when we use this software. And if we use this software against the licenses, then we can be taken to court eventually. This, everybody, was chapter 1 of the CISSP book. Looking at the chat room again, we don't have any questions. But if you decide that you want to ask questions and you want everybody to hear you or me to read your question, just post it on your on the meeting chat. Let's continue to chapter 2. Chapter 2 is a relatively quick one because we talk about personnel security and how we manage the risks in personnel, with people. Basically, managing your risks in personnel takes place in 3 different parts of the life cycle, if you may, of the employee. Before we hire the employee, during their employment, and then when we separate. We can separate by choice of the employee or the employer, but there is a separation there. It's a different one between the two. So when we hire people, first we want to do the background checks. Why do we want to do background checks? Because it's important to know who we bring in to our organization. It's important to screen the people and make sure that we have the right candidates to work in the organization. And also, as the organization gets bigger and bigger in numbers of personnel, it's important to create the culture behind those people, that everybody represents the same culture. And the culture can help us a lot with security. We can create a security-oriented culture, or information security can be embedded in the recruiting phases of new employees. Then we look at the way we do, the way we educate our employees. So the awareness, training, and education are 3 different types of empowering our workforce. The awareness takes place with everybody in the organization. So if you may, when you do awareness training is when you do a session for all users in your organization. You do a phishing campaign. You do anything that is connected to everybody in the organization, and everybody will participate in it. But when you do training, you take a certain group of personnel and you train them a little bit more on what they already do. So, for example, us as security professionals, when we take the CISSP, we take the CISSP training. So it's not like we learn a new role, a new skill set that we didn't have before. It's just that we train a little bit more on what we do. The education, the third one is the education. When you do education, you take people and you teach them something that they don't know. For example, if I take my MBA, and I don't have MBA today, but I will have MBA once I complete all necessary tasks for the MBA, and I will get a new skill set, a new degree that I can work with. So look at the awareness training and education, kind of a build up to get your personnel into a higher level of professionalism. Now, when you hire your new employees, it's important to put in place all the standards, policies, and to make sure everybody understands them before they join the organization. So either you do it on the first day of the job, or you do it before they join. They actually start the first day, but it's important to do that as soon as possible as you get your new employees. Also, make sure you have security definitions or security criteria in your job description for specific roles. For executives, for example, you want executives to think about security, and this can be achieved when you work or co-work with HR, for example. So I can expect questions in your CISSP. How do you influence the level of security or security understanding or awareness of your personnel prior to the employment? So the answer will be to work with HR and get some security requirements on the job descriptions. Maybe be part of the background checks choice of the organization. Another personnel control that we have is called cross-training. So when we have people in certain roles and critical roles, we want them to do the cross-training so one can cover for the other. This also helps us detect fraud. The job rotation side is critical for detecting fraud, because when a fraud is being committed, then we assume that it cannot be committed by two people as easily as it can be committed by one person. So when you get the cross-training, one can cover for the other and then probably detect fraud that the other one is committing without even noticing the anomaly there. Again, fraud detection on that note as well, and we will conclude in 1 minute. On fraud detection, we do mandatory vacation. So we send people home on mandatory vacation. We ask them to be away from work for a period of probably a week or a few days. And we have someone else that took the cross-training covering for them, again, to detect fraud, to detect anomalies. So when the person is not there on their seat in the office, they cannot influence the fraud or whatever it is that they did, and we can better detect fraud. Last but not least for this session is the acceptable use policy. So all users must comply and agree to the AUP. And in CISSP exams, we see a lot of questions around AUP or even mentioning the AUP. Because this is a small part in your CISSP book, but a very important one for all employees, ISC like to ask questions about this as well. I'll go back to the chat room and see if we have any questions. No, we don't have any questions. You guys are being great today, even though I would love to hear from you and would love to answer answer your questions during the sessions. I'll respect everybody's time today and say thank you everyone for participating in this important session. And the next session next week will be again Monday, Israel time, 5 o'clock, 5 to 6, and be prepared for more risk management, a lot of risk management next session.